Eleanor Vance was a connoisseur of the macabre, a collector of the unsettling. Her antique shop, Curio and Coil, in the sleepy town of Ashwood, was less a business and more a museum of forgotten whispers. She specialized in items that felt heavy with history, imbued with stories no one dared to tell. One rain-swept Tuesday, a package arrived from a reclusive estate sale in Blackwood County, an estate known only for its owner's sudden and unexplained disappearance. Inside the reinforced wooden crate, nestled in layers of velvet, was a mirror. It wasn't just any mirror. It was crafted from obsidian, polished to an impossible, oily blackness. The frame was intricately carved from dark, unfamiliar wood, depicting intertwined serpents and strange, angular symbols that seemed to writhe in the dim light. It was impossibly heavy, colder than it should have been, and completely devoid of reflection. Eleanor, accustomed to strange objects, found herself drawn to it with an almost magnetic pull. When she touched its surface, a chill, like plunging her hand into icy water, shot up her arm. She saw no reflection of her own face, only a deeper, shifting darkness within the obsidian. It was a window to nothing, or perhaps to everything. "Remarkable," she murmured, a shiver tracing its way down her spine. But unsettling. She placed the mirror on a stand in the back of her shop, covering it with a thick velvet cloth. Its presence, even hidden, made the other antiques seem nervous. Small bells on the door jingled without a breeze. The air grew perceptibly colder around it. That night, alone in the shop after closing, Eleanor heard it. A faint, almost inaudible whisper, like dry leaves rustling across polished stone. It was coming from behind the velvet cloth. She hesitated, a knot of professional curiosity and primal fear tightening in her stomach. She knew better than to disturb a piece of this magnitude after dark. But the whisper grew, taking on a strange, melodic quality, like a forgotten lullaby. She slowly approached the mirror, her hand trembling as she reached for the cloth. As her fingers brushed the velvet, the whispering intensified, accompanied by a subtle, deep thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards. With a deep breath, Eleanor pulled the cloth away. The mirror's surface remained black, but now, a faint, milky white image began to form within its depths. It wasn't her reflection. It was the distorted, pleading face of a young woman, eyes wide with terror, mouth agape in a silent scream. As Eleanor stared, captivated by the horrific tableau, the face in the mirror slowly, agonizingly began to change. Its features stretched, distorted, and then reformed into a familiar image. It was Eleanor's face, but this reflection was older, gaunt, her eyes hollow with a despair she had never known. Her lips, dry and cracked, slowly moved, forming a single, silent word. "Run." Eleanor barely slept. The image of her own hollowed-out face haunted her dreams, turning them into a maze of obsidian corridors. Despite her fear, she didn't hide the mirror away the next morning. A professional obsession took hold, a need to understand the mechanism behind the obsidian. The shop opened at 10. Her first customer was Julian Reed, a local historian with a failing memory and a desperate look in his eyes. He was searching for a missing volume of the Ashwood Chronicles, a book that had been lost for a century. "I can't find it, Eleanor," Julian whispered, his hands shaking as he leaned over the counter. "My legacy is slipping through my fingers. If I don't find that record, my life's work is a ghost story." Eleanor found herself leading him to the back of the shop. She didn't know why. It felt like her feet were being guided by a rhythm only she could hear. She pulled back the velvet cloth. Julian gasped. He didn't see a scream or a gaunt reflection. He saw a library. Within the black depths of the obsidian, a perfectly rendered image appeared, a hidden shelf behind a false wall in his own basement. On that shelf sat the missing leather-bound volume, its gold lettering gleaming. "It's there," Julian breathed, his face transforming from despair to ecstatic hunger. How can I get it?" The mirror didn't speak, but a silver mist began to swirl behind the glass. Small, jagged words etched themselves into the obsidian from the inside. one fragment of sight. What does that mean? Eleanor asked, her voice cracking. Julian didn't care. Anything. I'd give anything. He reached out and pressed his palm against the glass. The obsidian rippled like oil. For a second, Julian's right, I turned a milky, sightless white, as if the color had been vacuumed out of it. He cried out, clutching his face, but then he laughed. I see it. I remember now. The basement, the wall. He ran out of the shop, half blind but triumphant. Eleanor watched him go, a cold dread settling in her chest. She looked back at the mirror. The silver mist had settled, but the mirror was no longer empty. In the corner of the glass, a tiny, glowing spark appeared. A piece of Julian's vision, trapped like a firefly in a jar. By the afternoon, the shop felt crowded. People who hadn't visited in years began to trickle in. A young woman named Clara, desperate for the love of the man who didn't notice her. A businessman named Marcus, whose company was on the verge of bankruptcy. They all ended up at the mirror. The mirror showed them exactly what they wanted. Clara saw a wedding ring. Marcus saw a ledger filled with black ink. But the price was always the same, a fragment. A patch of skin, a childhood memory, the ability to taste sweetness, the sound of a mother's voice. Stop it, Eleanor whispered to the empty room as the sun began to set. You're hollowing them out. She grabbed a hammer, determined to shatter the obsidian. But as she raised the tool, the mirror rippled again. This time, it showed her Ava, the younger sister Eleanor had lost in a tragic fire 10 years ago. Ava was standing in a field of lilies, looking healthy, vibrant, and very much alive. Ava reached out a hand, pressing it against the glass from the other side. Don't break me, Elle. The image of her sister seemed to say. I'm almost home. The following morning, Ashwood didn't feel like the same town. It was as if a layer of color had been peeled away from reality. As Eleanor walked to her shop, she noticed a strange silence in the streets. People were moving, but they were different. She saw Julian Reed sitting on a bench, clutching his missing chronicle. He was smiling, but his right eye remained that dead, milky white. Worse, his movements were jerky, like a clock with missing gears. He seemed to have forgotten how to walk in a straight line. A fragment of his coordination had been left in the obsidian. Then she saw Clara. The young woman was walking hand in hand with her lover, looking radiant. But when Clara turned to wave at Eleanor, her hand was missing its ring finger. Not a wound, not a scar, just smooth, unbroken skin where the finger had been. The price, Eleanor whispered, her stomach churning. It's not just a metaphor. When she arrived at Curio and Coyle, the shop was already surrounded. A crowd of townspeople stood in the rain, their faces pale and hungry. They weren't there to buy antiques. They were there for the mirror. They had heard the whispers. They all had something they were willing to trade. Eleanor tried to block the door, but Marcus, the businessman, pushed past her. He looked haggard. His company had been saved overnight, but his voice was gone. He gestured frantically at the mirror, holding out a diamond watch. The mirror ignored the watch. The obsidian surface glowed with a predatory, violet light. It didn't want gold. It wanted essence. Eleanor watched in horror as the mirror began to act of its own accord. The velvet cloth she had used to cover it lay shredded on the floor. The obsidian surface had expanded, the frames stretching like pulled taffy until it dominated the entire back wall. The silent auction had begun. The symbols on the frame began to pulse. A low, rhythmic chanting filled the room, though no one was speaking. Within the glass, hundreds of fragments swirled. Colors of eyes, snippets of laughter, the scent of rain, the warmth of first loves. Each trade made the mirror more solid, while the people of Ashwood became more like ghosts. Get out, all of you, Eleanor screamed, grabbing a heavy brass candelabra and swinging it at the crowd. They didn't move. They were in a trance, watching the silver mist inside the glass. Then, the image of Ava appeared again. This time, she wasn't in a field of lilies. She was trapped in a cage made of black glass, her hands pressed against the surface. She looked terrified. The auction needs a master, Eleanor. A voice echoed, seemingly from the shadows of the room. It was a cold, multi-tonal voice that sounded like several people speaking at once. The fragments are the currency, but the soul is the prize. Bid for your sister. Bid for her life. What do you want? Eleanor cried out to the empty air. The mirror rippled. The words etched themselves into the glass. Your reflection. All of it. Eleanor realized what it meant. To save Ava, she would have to give up her existence in the physical world. She would become a permanent resident of the Obsidian, while the entity inside the mirror would walk free in her skin. Around her, the townspeople began to collapse. Marcus fell to his knees as his skin turned the color of gray ash. Clara's hair began to fall out in clumps. The mirror was draining them all to fuel the final transaction. Eleanor retreated to the small office at the back of the shop, locking the door against the mindless crowd. The sound of their scratching at the wood sounded like dry bone on a tombstone. She ignored the pounding and dove into a stack of old ledgers and estate records she had retrieved from the Blackwood sale. Hidden within the back of a hollowed-out diary belonging to the estate's previous owner, a man named Silas Blackwood, she found a sketch of the mirror. Silas hadn't been an artist. He had been an occult engineer. According to his frantic, ink-stained notes, the obsidian wasn't mined from the earth. It was forged from the grief of 1,000 widows and polished with the breath of the dying. Silas had titled the project The Great Exchange. The mirror is a stomach, 1 entry red. It craves the unique. It digests the things that make a human soul distinct. The flaws, the specific pains, the secret shames. Once it has consumed enough fragments, it can project a false life into our world. But to truly manifest, it requires a vessel of pure reflection. Eleanor realized with a jolt of terror that the entity wasn't just auctioning off her sister. It was using her sister's image as bait to lure Eleanor into a trade that would finalize the mirror's physical birth. Suddenly, the office door didn't just rattle, it dissolved. The wood turned into a fine, black sand that poured onto the floor. Standing in the doorway was Julian Reed. His eyes were now both milky white, and his skin was stretched so tight over his skull that it was beginning to tear. The bidding is almost over, Eleanor. Julian rasped, his voice sounding like 2 stones grinding together. Marcus has given his breath. Clara has given her heart's rhythm. The mirror is hungry for the masterpiece. He lunged for her with unnatural speed. Eleanor dodged, grabbing a heavy iron letter opener from her desk. She didn't strike Julian. She knew he was just a puppet. Instead, she sprinted past him, back into the main room of the shop. The shop was no longer a room. The walls had faded into a dark, infinite void. Only the mirror remained, standing 10 feet tall, glowing with a fierce, pulsating violet light. Inside, the image of Ava was screaming, her voice finally breaking through the glass as a high-pitched, electronic shriek. "I won't trade my reflection." Eleanor shouted at the obsidian. "I know what you are, Silas. I know you're in there." The silver mist inside the mirror coalesced into a tall, thin figure wearing a 19th century suit. It was Silas Blackwood himself, or at least the version of him the mirror had eaten decades ago. "Reflection is a lie." Eleanor, Silas's image spoke, his mouth moving in sync with the violet pulses. "In here, there is no decay. There is no fire to take your sister. There is only the archive. Give us yourself, and the archive will be complete." Eleanor looked at the iron letter opener in her hand. She remembered a line from the diary. "The mirror cannot digest that which is broken by its own hand." She looked at her sister's terrified face. She knew she couldn't win by force, and she couldn't win by trade. She had to offer a true sacrifice, something the mirror wanted, but something that would poison it. "You want my reflection?" Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a cold, steady whisper. "Then take it. But you take it all, the fire, the guilt, and the debt." She didn't press her palm to the glass. She took the iron letter opener and carved a jagged symbol into her own forearm. The symbol for debt she had seen in the Silas Blackwood diary. The mirror shrieked. It didn't like the blood. It wanted the unique, but Eleanor was offering it the burden. As Eleanor's blood touched the obsidian surface, the mirror didn't ripple. It convulsed. The violet light turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The symbols on the frame began to smoke, emitting a smell like burning hair and old parchment. Eleanor had tricked the mechanism. By branding herself with the debt symbol, she wasn't just offering her reflection. She was tying the mirror to the physical consequences of its own greed. The mirror was an eater of souls, but it could not handle the weight of human guilt. Coward! The voice of Silas Blackwood roared from the depths. You pollute the archive. I'm not a collector anymore. Silas, Eleanor yelled, the pain in her arm flaring like white-hot wire. I'm the one who settles the bill. The glass surface suddenly became soft, like thick, black gelatin. Eleanor didn't wait. She plunged her hands into the obsidian. It felt like sticking her arms into a hive of freezing insects. The cold was so intense it felt like burning. She leaned forward, her shoulders disappearing into the blackness. And then, with a sickening pop, she was pulled entirely inside. The world inside the mirror was a nightmare of geometry. She was standing on a floor made of frozen memories. Thousands of faces, the townspeople of Ashwood, were trapped beneath her feet, their expressions caught in a loop of silent screams. Above her, the fragments she had seen earlier, colors, scents, sounds, were swirling in a massive, chaotic cyclone. In the center of this storm was the cage. Ava was there, but she looked like a drawing that had been partially erased. Her legs were gone, replaced by wisps of silver smoke. Her eyes were leaking black ink. Ava! Eleanor ran toward the cage, but the ground shifted. The figure of Silas Blackwood materialized in front of her. He wasn't a reflection anymore. He was a towering pillar of shards, his body made of broken glass from 1,000 different eras. You think you could just walk out with the prize? Silas hissed, his voice echoing from every shard of his body. The auction is closed. The price was set. If you take her, the vacuum created will collapse the entire archive. You will both be crushed into a single grain of sand. Then let it collapse. Eleanor reached the cage. The bars weren't metal. They were made of the town's stolen fragments. She saw Julian's sight, Marcus's voice, and Clara's heart rhythm woven together to form the lock. Eleanor realized she couldn't break the lock with force. She had to return the fragments to their owners. She began to pull at the bars, not trying to snap them, but trying to unspeak them. Julian, see your way home, she shouted, grabbing the milky white shard. Marcus, scream for your life. She grabbed the vibrating thread of sound. As she tore the cage apart, the archive began to shake. The sky of the void started to crack like a dropped lens. Silas let out a piercing shriek as his glass body began to lose its cohesion. Elle, you're fading, Ava whispered, her voice finally human again. Eleanor looked at her hands. Because she had entered the mirror without a formal trade, her body was being rejected by reality and the void simultaneously. She was turning into a cloud of black dust. Grab my hand, Ava, Eleanor commanded. We don't need a reflection to be real. As their fingers touched, a massive explosion of light erupted from the point of contact. The debt symbol on Eleanor's arm began to glow with a blinding gold intensity. The world didn't return with a bang, but with the sound of 1,000 glass bells shattering at once. Eleanor and Ava were thrown violently across the floor of Curio and Coil. The air was thick with a fine, black dust, the remains of the Obsidian Mirror. Eleanor gasped, clutching her chest. She was solid. She looked at her arm. The debt symbol was now a white scar, but the bleeding had stopped. Next to her, Ava lay shivering, her form fully restored, but her eyes were darting around in terror. Ava, are you okay? Eleanor reached out. I can hear everything, Ava whispered, her voice trembling. Not just you, everyone. Eleanor stood up and looked out the front window of the shop. The silent auction was over, but the damage was far from fixed. The town of Ashwood had become a living jigsaw puzzle. In the middle of the street, Marcus, the businessman, was screaming, but the voice coming out of his mouth was Clara's high-pitched, melodic soprano. Julian Reed was walking perfectly straight now, but he was staring at his hands in horror. They were the small, delicate hands of a young woman. The fragments hadn't just returned to their owners. They had been scrambled during the explosion. The mirror, in its final moments of spite, had redistributed the essence of Ashwood randomly. "It's a nightmare," Eleanor breathed. "They're wearing each other's lives." A man stumbled toward the shop door. It was Father Thomas, the local priest. But as he drew closer, Eleanor saw that his eyes were the piercing, cold blue of the town's wealthiest socialite, and he was humming a ribald tavern song he couldn't possibly know. "Eleanor," Father Thomas rasped, "I remember being at the bottom of a lake. I remember drowning in 1920. Why do I have these memories?" Eleanor realized the truth. The mirror hadn't just taken fragments from the living. It had released the archive of the dead it had consumed over decades. Ashwood was now populated by people whose bodies were shells for multiple, conflicting identities. Suddenly, the black dust on the floor began to vibrate. It wasn't dead. The shards of obsidian were slowly crawling toward each other, like iron filings drawn to a magnet. "The archive cannot be deleted," a distorted voice rose from the floorboards. Silas Blackwood wasn't gone. Without the large mirror to hold him, his consciousness had split into a million tiny fragments, one for every shard of glass. He was no longer one man. He was a swarm. The shards began to leap, embedding themselves into the skin of the confused townspeople. Julian screamed as a piece of black glass sank into his forehead. Marcus collapsed as a shard pierced his throat. "They're becoming the mirror, El," Ava cried, pointing at the crowd. "He's using them to rebuild himself." The people of Ashwood stopped wandering. They turned as one, their eyes turning that familiar, oily black. They were no longer a confused crowd. They were a hive mind, and they were all looking at the Vance sisters. The shop windows groaned under the pressure of a dozen hands. Outside, the Shard-Walkers stood in a terrifying, synchronized silence. Their skin rippled as if something sharp was moving just beneath the surface. Every few seconds, a jagged piece of obsidian would poke through a cheek or a forehead, then slide back in. "We can't stay here," Eleanor hissed, grabbing a heavy leather satchel. She shoved Silas Blackwood's diary inside along with a heavy iron lamp. "If they get inside, they'll use us as the cornerstone for the new archive." "Where do we go?" Ava asked, her voice cracking. "The whole town is infected. The diary mentions a foundation stone," Eleanor said, flipping through the scorched pages. Silas didn't start with a mirror. He started with a single, raw chunk of obsidian found in the Blackwood crypt. He called it the Primal Shard. "If we can find it and crush it, the secondary shards, the ones inside the people, will lose their magnetic north. They'll turn to dust." They escaped through the basement coal chute, crawling out into the damp, narrow alleyway behind the shop. The air in Ashwood was thick with a gray mist that tasted like copper and old blood. They moved like shadows toward the old cemetery on the edge of town. As they passed the town square, they saw Julian Reed. He was standing on top of the fountain, his body twisting in impossible angles. He was speaking, but the sound wasn't coming from his mouth. It was a metallic resonance vibrating from the shards in his chest. "The vessel is broken, but the wine remains," the Julian thing vibrated. "Search the Vance girls. They carry the dead." The Shard-Walkers turned toward the alley. Eleanor and Ava sprinted. They reached the Blackwood crypt just as the rain began to pour. The stone structure was overgrown with black ivy that looked like veins. The heavy iron door was slightly ajar, as if something had recently pushed its way out or invited someone in. Inside, the air was unnervingly warm. The walls were lined with the coffins of the Blackwood lineage, but every single one had been smashed open from the inside. The bodies weren't there. Silas didn't just eat their memories, Ava whispered, clutching Eleanor's arm. He used their bones. In the center of the crypt sat a stone altar. Embedded in the middle of the altar was a jagged, fist-sized piece of obsidian that pulsed with a dark, rhythmic light. It looked like a piece of a fallen star, raw and hungry. This was the Primal Shard. As Eleanor approached with a lantern, the shadows in the room began to detach themselves from the walls. They didn't have faces, but they wore the tattered remnants of 19th century clothing. "The archive does not accept returns." "Eleanor," a voice boomed from the darkness. Out of the shadows stepped the remains of Silas Blackwood. He wasn't made of glass anymore. He was a horrific construct of old bones held together by pulsing black obsidian veins. He stood 7 feet tall, his eyes 2 burning violet sparks in a hollow skull. "You're not a man anymore, Silas," Eleanor said, raising the iron lantern like a weapon. "You're just a glitch in the world. I am the only thing that is permanent." Silas roared, swinging a heavy, bone-clad arm. Eleanor dove for the altar, but the primal shard let out a frequency so high it shattered the glass of her lantern, plunging the crypt into near-total darkness. The darkness in the crypt was absolute, save for the rhythmic, violet heartbeat of the primal shard. Silas moved through the shadows with the sound of grinding stone and clicking bone. Eleanor scrambled across the floor, her hands searching for anything to use as a weapon. But the frequency from the shard was paralyzing her, making her muscles twitch in sync with its beat. "Eleanor!" Ava's voice rang out, but sounded different. It had a metallic, echoing quality, like a voice played through a distant radio. Eleanor looked toward the altar. Ava was standing over the primal shard. She wasn't cowering anymore. Her skin was glowing with a faint, silvery luminescence, the same mist that had filled the mirror. "The girl is a leak," Silas's voice hissed from the dark. "She spent too long in the archive. She is more data than flesh now." Silas lunged at Ava, his skeletal hand outstretched. But before he could touch her, Ava raised her hand. A wave of visible static erupted from her palm, hitting Silas and freezing him midair. The shards in his body vibrated violently, trying to pull away from his bones toward Ava. "I can feel them, El," Ava whispered, her eyes glowing a solid, brilliant white. "Every shard in town, every memory Silas stole, I can hear them all at once. They want to be free." "Ava, get away from that stone," Eleanor shouted, finally pushing herself up. "It's consuming you." Ava didn't listen. She placed both hands on the primal shard. The moment she touched it, her body arched in pain. The black obsidian began to climb up her arms like a living vine, turning her skin into dark glass. She was becoming the bridge, the connection between the primal shard and the thousands of fragments scattered throughout Ashwood. Through Ava's static connection, Eleanor saw flashes of the town. She saw the Shard-Walkers outside the crypt, falling to their knees, their bodies vibrating as Ava exerted her will. "Stop!" Silas roared, his form beginning to dissolve into a cloud of black dust as Ava drew the power away from him. "If you break the connection now, you will scatter your own soul into the wind. You will become nothing but noise." Ava looked at Eleanor. Tears of liquid silver ran down her cheeks. "He's right, El. I'm the only thing holding the shards together. If I crush the stone, I go with it. But if I don't, he'll take everyone." Eleanor realized the horrific choice. To save the town, she had to let her sister, the person she had spent her life trying to protect, dissolve into the void once more. "There has to be another way," Eleanor cried, reaching for Ava. "There isn't," Ava said, her voice now a choir of 1,000 echoes. "I was never supposed to come back from a fire, El. The mirror just delayed the end. But now, I can make the end mean something." Ava's hands began to glow with a blinding white light. The primal shard began to crack, emitting a sound like a screaming mountain. The crypt was shaking. Dust and ancient mortar rained down from the ceiling as the primal shard began to fracture under Ava's touch. The violet light was being drowned out by the brilliant, terrifying white glow emanating from Ava's veins. "Ava, stop! You're burning out!" Eleanor screamed, shielding her eyes. "I have to. Hold it." Ava's voice was fading, becoming a wash of white noise. "The shards in the town, they're coming back. I'm pulling them all into me." Eleanor looked through the crypt's open door. In the distance, thousands of black sparks were flying through the air, streaking toward the cemetery like dark shooting stars. The fragments of obsidian were being ripped out of the townspeople, leaving them unconscious but free. However, the cost was visible. Ava's legs had already turned into translucent glass. The black veins of the primal shard were wrapping around her heart. She wasn't just destroying the stone. She was becoming the new archive, and once the stone shattered, there would be no container left for her soul. Silas Blackwood's skeletal form was now just a pile of rattling bones on the floor, his consciousness flickering out as his power was siphoned away. "You fools," his skull clattered. "You are not ending the auction. You are just emptying the gallery." Eleanor looked at the leather satchel at her side. She remembered the debt scar on her arm. She realized that the mirror thrived on reflection, but it was destroyed by reality. She reached in her bag and pulled out the only object that mattered, an old, cracked locket she had saved from the fire 10 years ago. Inside was a photo of her and Ava as children and a lock of their mother's hair. It was a physical anchor, a piece of history that had no market value to the mirror because it was built on pure, selfless love. "Ava, look at me." Eleanor lunged forward, ignoring the searing heat of the static. She slammed the locket onto the altar right next to the cracking primal shard. "The mirror wants a vessel?" "Phoenix," Eleanor shouted. "But it won't be a void. It'll be a memory." She grabbed Ava's hand. The white light surged into Eleanor, threatening to tear her mind apart. She felt the weight of every stolen memory in Ashwood. The first kisses, the secret fears, the silent prayers. She channeled all of it through her body and into the locket. "Shift the frequency, Ava. Don't let it scatter. Push it into the locket." Ava gasped, her eyes snapping back to their natural color for a split second. She understood. Instead of letting the energy explode outward, they began to compress it. The locket began to glow with a soft, warm amber light, contrasting with the cold violet of the obsidian. The primal shard let out one final, ear-splitting shriek. "Now!" Eleanor yelled. With a thunderous crack, the obsidian stone exploded into fine, harmless sand. At the same moment, the white light vanished, sucked entirely into the small metal locket. Silence fell over the crypt. The silence in the crypt was deafening. The air, once thick with the smell of ozone and ancient dust, was now still. On the stone altar, the primal shard was gone, reduced to a heap of inert, black sand that looked like nothing more than common ash. Eleanor sat on the cold floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hands were scorched, and the white scar on her arm throbbed with a dull, fading heat. Slowly, she looked up. The altar was empty except for the locket. It didn't glow with the terrifying light of the archive. Instead, it emitted a soft, rhythmic amber pulse, slow and steady, like a deep sleep. Eleanor reached out with trembling fingers and picked it up. The metal was warm, humming with a vibration that felt remarkably like a heartbeat. "Ava," she whispered. The locket didn't speak, but a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace washed over Eleanor. It was a feeling of safety, of a summer afternoon long ago, of a sister's hand squeezed in hers. Ava was there. She wasn't gone, but she wasn't entirely back either. She was the safe partition of Ashwood's soul, anchored to the only thing that could hold her without consuming her. Eleanor stepped out of the crypt into the morning light. The mist had cleared. In the town square, the people of Ashwood were waking up. They were lying on the pavement, slumped over benches and leaning against walls. Julian Reed sat up and rubbed his eyes. They were clear, brown, and human once more. Marcus reached for his throat and let out a rasping cough. His own voice had returned. They looked around with the confused expressions of people waking from fever dream. They remembered the silent auction, but it felt distant now, like a story told by someone else. The shards were gone. The debt was paid. Eleanor walked through the town, clutching the locket to her chest. She saw the relief on their faces, but she also saw the gaps. The town was whole, but it was quiet. The greed that had fueled the mirror had been replaced by a somber realization of what they had almost lost. She returned to Curio and Coil. The shop was a wreck. The back wall, where the mirror had once stood, was just bare, weathered brick. The black dust had vanished. Eleanor sat behind her counter and placed the locket on a velvet cushion. She knew the rule now. The locket was a closed loop. If she ever opened it to try and pull Ava back into the physical world, the frequency would scatter and the archive might find a way back in. To keep Ava safe, Eleanor had to keep her contained. She was no longer a collector of the macabre. She spent the following weeks clearing out the shop, selling the heavy, cursed antiques, and replacing them with things that let in the light. Clocks that ticked reliably, books with happy endings, and mirrors that showed nothing but the truth. One evening, as the sun set over Ashwood, Eleanor sat by the window with a cup of tea. The locket sat on the table before her. "It's a beautiful sunset today, Ava," Eleanor said softly. The locket pulsed once, a warm amber glow reflecting in Eleanor's eyes. The silent auction was over. The masterpiece wasn't a soul sold to the dark, but a memory kept in the light. Ashwood was a town of ghosts no longer, but a town of survivors. And in a small shop in the corner, a technician of the soul kept watch over a golden heartbeat, making sure the silence stayed peaceful forever.